Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday night. Apologies that we're starting an hour later. And I hope you saw the notice that we posted on Facebook whenever there's a problem and we have to delay a class or make some kind of announcement about scheduling. We'll put it on the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page. So that's the place to check. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Shandor in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri, Guy in Ohio, Mario in Tijuana. Welcome, Mario. Bella in Florida, Shona in Canada, Nancy in North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Carla in Brazil, right? Welcome, Carla. Susie, shalom from Iowa. That's another new name. Welcome, Susie. Great to have you with us. Over there on the YouTube side, Chaim in Florida, Ella, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Spencer in Connecticut, Paul in the Great Northwest. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is page 12, Yud Beis, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 4? Yeah, Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 1 of Bava Metzia. Today we'll get to, God willing, Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 1. So Mishnah number 4 held that this person who, several people are running after an animal. The animal is fast, but not very fast. It's a deer that's lame or a pigeon that is young and not yet flying, and it diverts into somebody's field, and before the other people can get there, this guy says, my field has acquired the animal for me, and that works. But the discussion we had yesterday is that the person apparently needs to be standing near the field, and he sees this happening. And this is compared to somebody's courtyard acquiring property or something delivered, something sold, right? So different cases when there's a found object, an ownerless object, an object that's being transferred because of purchase and sale, a penalty that's being paid, right? These are different nuances. This general law where we're talking, we've been talking lots of aspects of these general laws of acquisition. When does something formally pass from the possession of one person to another? In a purchase and sale situation, the fact that the buyer has paid for it does not mean that he has acquired possession of it. And that protects the buyer, actually, because if it's still in the seller's possession and something happens to it, the seller is responsible. When does the object actually change hands? When there's a formal act of acquisition, a kinyan. A normal kinyan is picking it up, and an animal making it move. If the reins are passed from one person to another. And in certain cases, your courtyard can acquire something for you, even if it wasn't handed into your hand, but it is handed into your courtyard that you own, that you have control over. But one opinion is that only happens when you're standing there. Another opinion is it can happen even when you're not there. There's going to be a difference between when somebody is giving something, when somebody is selling something, or when something just gets dropped there that was previously ownerless. Okay, we pick this up near the top of page 12a. So the Gemara returns to discuss the matter itself. The Mishnah teaches, if one saw people running after a found ownerless animal, it was previously ownerless, now it's going to be found, that means that the first person who finds it and performs a kinyan, an act of acquisition, is going to become the new owner of this animal. Now back to our Mishnah. If one saw people running after a found ownerless animal and said, my field has effected acquisition of this animal for me, it has effected acquisition of it for him. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and this law is true only in a case where he would be able to run after the animal and catch it. right? That's what we were talking about, a deer that has a broken leg or a pigeon that's so young that it hasn't started flying yet. Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. Does one acquire animals that are given to him as a gift in this same scenario where if it was a found animal, he would acquire it? And Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana accepted the premise of the dilemma of Rabbi Yirmiyah and ruled that in the case of a gift, one acquires the animals even if he would not be able to run after them and catch them. It's easier to acquire when it's a gift because somebody is giving to another person on purpose. It's directed from the giver to the recipient. Whereas in this case of the ownerless animal, where several people are rushing to claim it, we're going to be a little bit more rigorous in defining who actually gained possession of the animal. Now, Rava raises a dilemma. If one threw a purse through this entrance of a house, and then went through the house and exited through another entrance, then what is the law? Right? So we're saying if a courtyard or a field can acquire property from a giver to a recipient, right? It doesn't have to be given into the hand of the recipient. It can be deposited on his property. Okay, so what if the giver, in an effort, to give it to the recipient, didn't throw it onto his property so that it landed, let's say, in his house, but rather this was a small house. It had a big open window in the front of the house and a big open window in the back of the house, and the giver throws this purse of money through the big window in the front, and he throws it a little too hard, a little too much enthusiasm, and it goes in the front window and out the back window and lands in the public domain. Did that person's house, the recipient's house, acquire the purse of money for him by virtue of the fact that it flew through the airspace of the house, even though it didn't land in the house? That's what's being asked. Does the owner of the house acquire the purse through the course of its flight? And the dilemma is like this. Is an item in the airspace of a courtyard that will not eventually come to rest in the courtyard itself regarded as though it has come to rest, or is it not regarded as though it has come to rest? And why is this being asked? Why are we bringing this example? Because we just said that for an animal that diverts into a field and the person says, oh, my field acquired the animal for me, that's only going to work if the animal is somewhat lame and it could actually, there's a reasonable expectation that it will stop running in that field and could easily be caught there. But if we're talking about an adult pigeon that could easily fly away, or an adult deer that's not hurt that could easily run away, they say that the field does not acquire the animal in the case of an ownerless animal, but it does acquire the animal in the case of a gift from a giver to a recipient. So since the animal could just sort of pass through the field, we're bringing this possibly analogous analogous law of a purse being thrown through the airspace of a house. If the airspace of the house can acquire the purse, then it makes sense that a field can acquire a deer, even though the deer could easily run through it, if it's a case of a gift from a giver to a recipient. So Rav Papa said to Rava, and some say that it was Rav Ada Bar Matana who said this to Rava, and some say that it was Ravina who said this to Rava. Isn't this the same as the law in our Mishna? As it is stated, if one saw people running after a found ownerless animal and said, my field has affected acquisition of this animal for me, it has affected acquisition of it for him. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and this law is true only in a case where he would be able to run after them and catch them. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. Does one acquire animals that are given to him as a gift in such a scenario? Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana accepted the premise and said, in the case of a gift, even if he would not be able to run after them and catch them, it would work. So Rava said to him, are you saying that a purse flying through the air is comparable to an item that is rolling, i.e. moving on the ground? The deer is running on the ground. Now, this gift of a pigeon, but it was started on the ground. It could fly away, but it wasn't flying. But let's just stick with the deer because we started with an example of an animal that was running and people were running after it. So are we going to compare a purse flying through the air to a deer running along the ground? A rolling item is different, as it is regarded as though it has come to rest. At any given instant throughout its movement, the item is resting on the ground. Therefore, our dilemma about the running deer cannot be resolved from the case of the flying purse. So we didn't learn out whether it works or not from that law, and we're not sure if it seems that where we're leaving off is that if the deer is a gift, then whether it can be caught or not, if it runs through the field has acquired it on behalf of the recipient. And the reason I'm saying that's where the law ends up, apparently, is because we just finished our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Now we move on to Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 1. With regard to the found item of one's minor son or daughter, i.e. an ownerless item that they found, or the found item of his Canaanite slave or maidservant, and the found item of his wife, they are his, meaning the members of the household, if they find something ownerless, because they are sustained and supported by the master of the household, right, the father, husband, so then anything they bring in that they find it technically belongs to the father. Now, he might let them keep it, but the actual legal ownership is in the father, since he is sustaining everyone in that household. By contrast, with regard to the found item of one's adult son or daughter, the found item of his Hebrew slave or maidservant, and the found item of his ex-wife whom he divorced, even if he has not yet given her payment of the marriage contract that he owes her, in all these cases, the found object belongs to those people. Right, the Hebrew slave in someone's household is sustained by him, but won't be there forever. Now, that's also the case of the minor son or daughter. They will grow up, but while they're minor son or daughter, what they find belongs to the father. But the adult son or daughter, no, it belongs to them. And even his ex-wife, even though she might technically still be supported by him because he hasn't paid the ketubah payment after their divorce, nevertheless, she owned whatever she finds belongs to her and not to her soon-to-be completely severed ex-husband. Now, that's the Mishnah. Here comes the Gemara. Shmuel says, for what reason did the sages say that the found item of one's minor son or daughter belongs to his father? It is because the minor does not intend to acquire it for himself, as when he finds it, he runs with it to his father and does not retain it in his possession. Everything you found when you were a kid, you went running to your dad, look what I found? Maybe. The Gemara asks, is this to say that Shmuel holds that a minor does not have the capability of acquiring property for himself by Torah law? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa with regard to one who hires a salaried laborer to harvest his field? The son of the laborer may glean fallen stalks from behind the laborer, like any poor person who has the right to the stalks left in the field, right? The leftover gleanings belong to the poor. So the father has been hired. He's a laborer. He's not considered the poor because he has a job. But his son could be considered the poor, and he can walk along behind the father and pick up the gleanings. And that seems to be permitted. But if we say that anything that belongs to the minor child of a father belongs to the father, but we just said the father's not poor, so how can we say that the child is considered like the poor? But if one hires a laborer as a sharecropper, then whether the laborer receives 1/2, 1/3, or 1/4 of the produce, his son may not glean stalks after him, as the laborer himself is considered a partial owner of the field, and he's consequently not considered poor. So a hired laborer can be considered poor, but a sharecropper cannot because he is a partial owner of the field. Rabbi Yosef says in both this case and that case, the laborer's son and wife may glean after him. Yeah, a sharecropper can be considered the poor, just like the laborer can be considered the poor. And his family members who are poor can collect the gleanings after him. And Rabbi Yosef may glean. And Shmuel says that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, right? That the spouse, the wife or children of this poor person who's harvesting somebody else's field, whether the relationship is technically a hired laborer or a sharecropper, they can collect the gleanings of the poor. Now, granted, if you say that a minor has the capability of acquiring property for himself, Shmuel's opinion is understood as when the son gleans stalks, he gleans them for himself and he acquires them, and his father subsequently acquires them from him as a gift. Since the minor has no property of his own, his status is that of a poor person, and it is permitted for him to glean stalks. But if you say that a minor does not have the capability of acquiring property for himself, then when he gleans the stalks, he gleans them for his father. And since his father is technically considered wealthy and is not entitled to the gleanings because he owns a portion of the produce as a sharecropper, why do we say that his wife and son may glean stalks after him? And the Gemara answers, in Shmuel's explanation, Shmuel is stating the reason of the Tana of our Mishnah, but he himself does not hold accordingly. Rather, Shmuel holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, that a minor can acquire property for himself. And the Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yosei hold that a minor has the capability of acquiring property by Torah law? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah, Tractate Gittin, 59b, with regard to the found items of a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor, i.e. lost items that they found, although they are not considered to be legally competent to enter contracts, etc., and therefore they are unable to acquire found items by Torah law, nevertheless, taking such items away from them is considered robbery by rabbinic law, and the sages decreed this for the sake of the ways of peace. And Rabbi Yosei says, not just by rabbinic ordinance, but rather this is full-fledged robbery, meaning that minor children can acquire something for themselves. And Rav Chisda says that Rabbi Yosei means that it is full-fledged robbery by rabbinic law. And the practical difference between the opinion of the first Tana and Rabbi Yosei's opinion is that according to Rabbi Yosei, if the robber refuses to return the stolen item, it is appropriated by the judges and returned to its owner. In any event, it is evident from here that Rabbi Yosei also holds that a minor cannot acquire property for himself by Torah law, because it's by rabbinic law that he's considered to be the owner. So rather, Abaye rejected the above explanation of Rabbi Yosei's opinion in the Baraisa with regard to gleaning. And he said, the reason that according to Rabbi Yosei, a sharecropper's son may glean after him despite the fact that he does not acquire property by Torah law is that in such a case, the sages rendered the field like one through which the last gleaners have walked. Once the poor people have finished gleaning stalks from a field, even wealthy people are permitted to collect whatever remains. So in this case, since the sharecropper's son is walking behind him, the poor people themselves dismiss the notion of gleaning in this field from their minds. They assume that the son of this sharecropper is gleaning for him, and they will therefore not find any gleanings in this field. And since the poor people themselves have finished taking stalks from the field, the sharecropper's son can glean for his father. Rav Ada bar Matana said to Abaye, but how is it permitted for one to allow his son to follow him in the field, thereby causing all the other poor people to leave? Is a person permitted to have a lion crouch in his field so that the poor people will see it and flee? Right? Are you allowed to have not a scarecrow, but a scare person to scare away the poor people? Obviously, no. The whole mitzvah of leaving the corner of the field and the gleanings that were left behind the harvesters and any forgotten sheaves for the poor is so that the poor can come and take them. That's a Torah law, an absolutely, emphatic written Torah law. So obviously you don't circumvent that by putting in some kind of a device that will scare away the poor so they don't take it. So if that's the case, this idea that the children of the sharecropper gleaning behind them will sort of announce to onlookers that all the gleanings have been taken and that's why this child is allowed to take, Well, that would be the equivalent of a lion scaring away the poor, since they're going to think, well, there's nothing there, I might as well not go in there. So rather, Rava stated an alternative explanation. And now we're on page 12b. The sages instituted an ordinance rendering a son of the sharecropper who does not have the right to acquire property like one who has the right to acquire property, i.e. they granted him a special right to acquire the gleanings. And what is the reason for this particular ordinance? It's not that minors can normally acquire property for themselves, but the son of the sharecropper can acquire gleanings for himself by special ordinance. And the reason is this arrangement is satisfactory for the poor people themselves, so that when they are hired under similar terms, their sons will also be able to glean the stalks after them. It protects the poor by allowing people, who are hired to do this difficult labor, that a perk of it is that their children can come along behind and pick the gleanings because they are poor people. And now the Gemara comments, and Shmuel, in his above explanation of the Mishnah, disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Chiya bar Abba. As Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, the word adult in the Mishnah is not referring to an actual adult, and the word minor is not referring to an actual minor. Rather, with regard to an adult son who is dependent on the food of his father's table for support, this is considered a minor in the context of our Mishnah. It is appropriate for one who is reliant on his father's support to give items that he finds to his father, as that's a way to contribute to the household. And with regard to a minor son who is not dependent on the food of his father's table for support, this is considered an adult in this context, and any lost item that he finds is his. Right? So if we actually were watching last night the movie The Boys in the Boat, very good movie. And and one of the main characters was a kid during the Depression, whose father had run off when he was 14 years old, and he supported himself, and just working, very difficult jobs, and actually, got himself a half scholarship to go to University of Washington, and kind of against all odds was getting that college education. But even when he was 15, since he's supporting himself, he certainly doesn't owe his father anything. He is a minor, but he can keep anything he finds because he's supporting himself. Now, the Mishnah teaches the found item of a man's Hebrew slave or maidservant, it is theirs, as opposed to a Canaanite slave or maidservant, which would belong to the owner. So the Gemara asks, why does it not belong to the master? Let the slave be considered merely a laborer, and it is taught in a Baraisa that the found item of a laborer, i.e. a lost item that he found, belongs to him and not to his employer. So in what case is this statement that the item belongs to the laborer said? It is when the employer told the laborer to perform a specific task. For example, he said to him, weed for me today, or till the soil for me today. Since the employer specified the task that he hired the laborer to perform, and that task did not include finding lost items, the laborer has rights to the item that he himself found. But if the employer said to the laborer, work for me today in an unspecified task, just be my general employee today, then the found items of that laborer belong to the employer, as finding ownerless items is included within the general category of work. Now go back to the Hebrew slave. He is duty bound to perform all types of labor for his master. So why doesn't his master acquire all items that the Hebrew slave finds? Right? The master is sustaining the Hebrew slave. The slave finds himself in this position because either he was a thief who couldn't pay back what he stole, and so the court sentenced him to 6 years of indentured servitude as a Hebrew slave, or he sold himself into slavery because he was so poor he couldn't feed himself. Now, for the period of time that he sold himself, which could be 6 years or more in the case of one who sells himself into that situation, his master is obligated, to feed him and clothe him and to give him a bed and a pillow that is of no worse condition than what the master himself sleeps on. Having a Hebrew slave is not like such a bargain. But at any rate, he's obligated to do any kind of work that the master asks him to do. So why are we going to distinguish between the general laborer, that what he finds belongs to the master, but the Hebrew slave, what he finds belongs to himself? Why? And Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, here we are dealing with a Hebrew slave who pierces pearls, which is such a profitable activity that his master would not want to transfer him to another line of work even for a moment. Therefore, his status is like that of a laborer who is hired to perform a specific task. And this would seem to indicate, but if he's not a specialist with such a valuable skill, then whatever he finds would belong to his master. Rava said, instead, we are dealing with a case where the slave lifts a found item along with performing his work. Since there is no need for him to interrupt his work in order to take the item, his taking the item costs his master nothing, and that's why it belongs to the slave. But if, spending time recovering the lost item was time that he spent away from his obligations as a Hebrew slave, then it would belong to the master. Rav Papa said an item found by a laborer belongs to his employer only in the case where he hired him specifically to collect found items. And the Gemara asks, but what are the circumstances in which one would hire a person to find ownerless items? And the Gemara answers, it is a case where a lake flooded its shore with fish, and after the water receded, the fish remained on the shore. These are ownerless fish, so one would hire laborers to gather those fish. And that's where that discussion ends. The Mishnah, back to our Mishnah, teaches that an item found by a Hebrew maidservant belongs to her. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of this maidservant? If the reference is to a maidservant who has grown 2 hairs, meaning she's reached puberty, which is why then is she with her master? A Hebrew maidservant who reaches adulthood is emancipated. Right, this was the case of a very poor family who sold their minor girl to be a house servant, for another family until she reaches marriageable age. At that point, she leaves that servitude, and presumably they're going to marry her off. Again, they can't feed her at home, but now they'll be able to marry her off because she's reached the age of getting married. But they might have sold her, to be a Hebrew maidservant until that time. They were child servants because it was better that than starving. And if she's a maidservant who has not, yet reached puberty, then if her father is still alive, the found item belongs to her father. And if her father is not still alive, well, then she should have gone free with the death of her father. Interesting that if she was sold into servitude and her father dies, she goes free. And as Reish Lakish says, a Hebrew maidservant acquires herself from the authority of her master if her own father dies. And this law is derived from a kal v'chomer inference. And how does that work? If reaching puberty releases her from her master's authority, but does not release her from her father's authority, as although reaching puberty, she still remains under her father's authority with regard to certain matters. Therefore, is it not logical that her father's death, which would release her entirely from her father's authority, would also release her from the authority of her master? Clearly, there is no situation where a Hebrew maidservant can acquire an item that she finds because she's a maidservant. Right? If she's a maidservant, then it belongs to her master. If her father dies, then she's released from servitude and it would belong to her because she's not a maidservant anymore. And the Gemara answers, but wasn't the opinion of Reish Lakish conclusively refuted? It is not accepted as the law. And the Gemara suggests, let us say that there is a conclusive refutation of his opinion from this Mishnah as well. If a Hebrew maidservant is emancipated when her father dies, well, then there is no possible situation in which a Hebrew maidservant who finds an ownerless item acquires it for herself. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. This Mishnah is not a refutation of Reish Lakish's opinion, as perhaps it is actually referring to a case where the father is alive. And what is the meaning of the phrase, they are theirs? It does not mean that the item belongs to the maidservant. Rather, it is stated in order to exclude the possibility that it belongs to her master. In a situation where something would go to her rather than her master, if she's still a minor girl, it would then go to her father. right? But is it possible for a maidservant to find something and keep it? Yeah, we just talked about that. That a Hebrew maidservant who finds something, and we might limit the circumstances, but there certainly are circumstances where a maidservant finds something that belongs to her. If she's a minor, it would pass to her father rather than to her master. But that's what the Mishnah meant to teach. It wouldn't go to the master. It would go to the girl, and if the girl has a father, it would go to the father. Enough about that. I'm almost done. So if you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. Short daf today. So the Mishnah teaches that the found item of a man's ex-wife, whom he divorced, belongs to her. That's obvious. But you might say it might not belong to her if he has not yet given her the ketubah payment that he owes her at the time of the divorce. So they're still dealing with each other. And so even though he's given her the bill of divorce, since he hasn't paid her the money he owes her, maybe things that she finds would belong to him until he pays that. But the answer is no. Since he gave her the get, whatever she finds is hers. And the Gemara asks, if he divorced her, it is obvious that the item is hers. Why does the Mishnah specify this? And the Gemara answers, here we're dealing with a case where there is uncertainty as to whether she is divorced or whether she is not divorced. As Rabbi Zera says, that Shmuel says, everywhere that the sages said that there is uncertainty whether a woman is divorced or whether she is not divorced, then her husband remains obligated to sustain her, to feed her, shelter, etc. Furthermore, the sages instituted an ordinance that an item found by a wife belongs to her husband, and that this right is reciprocal to his obligation to provide for her sustenance. Therefore, one might reason that here too, since the husband is still obligated to provide for his wife, he retains the right to items that she finds. But this is not the law. As what is the reason that the sages said that an item found by a wife belongs to her husband? It is so that she should not be subject to her husband's enmity due to the fact that he is supporting her and yet she keeps any item that she finds. Here, however, let her be subject to Let her be subject to much enmity. He should resolve the uncertainty and finalize the divorce as soon as possible. And perhaps the fact that she's keeping items even while he's sustaining her, might make him angry and motivate him to complete the divorce. We don't want the woman to be stranded. So if he's started a divorce, they're not really living as husband and wife, but she has not finalized the divorce, so she's not free to go marry someone else. And we want to encourage him to finish the divorce. That's what I've got for us today. Tomorrow we'll pick it up near the, 12b is pretty short. And I'm just stopping here so that tomorrow we open with Mishnah number 6, which will attach to our reading of page 13. Nina's telling me no comments or questions, so